Thank you so much for joining us. Inflation, higher egg prices, bird flu, all factors resulting in some East Texans raising their own chickens. And a Texas lawmaker is proposing a bill that would allow people in all municipalities to do just that, raise chickens. KLTV7's Bob Hallmark explains.
Texas State Senator Bob Hall of Rockwall is proposing a new bill that will allow Texans within a city limit to keep chickens.
Just individual freedom, individual rights, self-sufficiency. You know, we have had some disasters, and chickens are something that would allow people to have self-sufficiency.
Some East Texas municipalities already have ordinances that allow the raising of livestock and poultry. Longview is one of them.
We've had an ordinance that discusses people's ability to keep livestock, or particularly like chickens, in their property in town. During the last legislative session, there was a law that passed that preempted our ability to control that portion of neighborhoods.
Senate Bill 141 would restrict municipalities from adopting or enforcing an ordinance that prohibits the raising or keeping of 6 or fewer chickens.
But we do have some communities and things that prohibit people from having them. So it's liberty, individual rights for eggs. And therefore, and the price has gone up significantly. And so for those that would like to raise their own, see no reason not to.
Economically, Hall says it makes sense for people to grow their own.
I have not yet seen anybody come up with a good reason for people not to have chickens.
Bob Hallmark, KLTV 7 News.
We should mention, if passed, Senate Bill 141 would have no authority over homeowners associations.